at least joining me all the way from Abuja is Joseph Amos, a renewable energy expert who will be helping us to shed light on the reform of President Bola Ahmed Tinubu in the power sector. Joseph, a very good day to you.
Thank you so much for having me. Good afternoon.
All right, it's nice seeing you, and a very interesting aspect that we'll be bringing to our discussion today. Joe, let me first ask you, before President Bola Ahmed Tinubu came to power in 2023, what was your own assessment or review of the power sector before his coming?
All right. So, thanks again for having me. Before Tinubu joined office, we've always had an energy issue within the country. There's been very poor energy supply. I mean, even up until now, we still have only about 4,000 megawatts as a country, and that is barely enough to serve Lagos market as a whole. So, yes, electricity has been a serious issue long before Bola Ahmed Tinubu entered into office. And regardless, there's also been an increase in the energy demand because you're having more people, you're having an increase in population, you're having more companies springing up. And the consequence of that is that you also have an increase in energy demand. So what we've been having is a situation where there's been a perpetual increase in energy demand over the years without a subsequent increase in energy supply. So what you have is a world where both before Bola Ahmed Tinubu and even under his current government, we have situations where the demand cannot match up supply due to certain inefficiencies that exist in the entire system.
Exactly.
So yes, we've always had those energy issues and they still exist till today. And the conversation from here on now has to be, how then do we resolve those energy issues so that they don't remain a problem for the future?
Exactly. I really love the way you are pushing this narrative in a way that we can find solution. But before we get to that level, many have argued and said the privatization exercise of the electricity sector in Nigeria has failed. Do you also share in that sentiment that going into privatization is a bad decision by the government at that time?
Absolutely. So I think that privatization is one of the worst things that could have happened to the energy industry, to the electricity industry as a whole. And it's largely because the form of privatization that happened, what necessarily happened was a case where public assets that had been developed by public funds were transferred into the hands of a few capitalists and a few people who have the capital to purchase. The funny thing yet again about this conversation around privatization and why that privatization was problematic was largely because the entire process of that privatization wasn't as transparent as it could have been. And we've seen those same issues to repeat itself in so many other sectors where you don't have transparency within the contracting system. But first of all, there was lack of transparency. And the eventual people who bought it, there were two big challenges with them. One, they lacked the technical competence that was required to run the systems. Because remember, we're talking of electrical systems. And electrical companies are very complicated systems with so many moving parts. And hence why they are also segregated into 3 different categories. But yeah, you had people who had no technical competence, and they also didn't necessarily have the full financial backing to even buy the companies. If you go back to 2013, when the privatization happened, almost everybody who bought those companies only paid 25% of the funds. The rest were covered by the banks. That in and of itself is yet another problem. Because with the banks covering those costs, what then happened was, after a while, the companies couldn't pay back the loans to the banks. So what happened? The CBN had to reintervene and spent about 2 trillion in dissolving some of the risks and absorbing the risks. Why? Because electricity as an entity or electricity as a service is necessary for the sustenance of the society, which means that in the event that it's failing, regardless of why it is failing, the government still has an onus on them to intervene in those instances. So if you look at it, right, holistically, we sold those companies for roughly about 3 billion naira, and for roughly about 3 billion naira. So 30 billion naira is what we sold those companies, and over the time between 2013 and now, we have spent over 2 trillion reinvesting in the energy industry. So it then begets the question, what then was the essence of selling those companies if at the end of the day, it's still taxpayers' money that will be used to run the companies and liberate the companies when they fail? Because what you have then done is you have privatized the companies, and by virtue of privatization, you now leave price setting and whatnot in the hands of private capital. And remember, that private capital is always driven by profit and profit incentives.
Exactly.
And that is yet another challenge with privatization of assets like this, because electricity as a service cannot be determined by who is the highest buyer. Every individual who exists within society is supposed to have access to stable electricity by virtue of the fact that that individual is a tax-paying member of society, he's supposed to be able to access electricity. But now we have allowed private capital come into the conversation, and by virtue of coming into the conversation, they have reshaped the narrative. And now we are paying through our teeth. So they now tell you, oh, there's a band A, there's a band B, there's a band C. And so by virtue of how much you are able to afford, it now determines how much electricity you can have available to you. This is a fundamental problem with the concept of privatization of this kind of assets. And that's why, this initiative was one of the worst things that could have happened to the industry, because at the end of the day, the government absorbed all the risks, the government did the bailout, and those assets are now transferred into the hands of private capital, who still own those assets till today. So we ask ourselves, what was the point? Because we don't see the benefits. We've not had any marginal increase in energy supply in that period. We've only had maybe about 2% improvement in the grid supply in that period. And yet cost has risen significantly within that same period. So what then was the benefit? So we are back to that same point. And in retrospect, we realized that was one of the worst decisions that could have been made at the time.
I think a lot of people will agree with you, Joseph, on this particular narrative, particularly a very, intelligent submission in this regard that you have brought to the fore, talking about the privatization that many have regarded as failed. But I believe maybe because of this failure of the privatization that is making President Tinubu to take a bold step, particularly the signing of the Electricity Act 2023. What do you make of the signing of the Electricity Act 2023? Because this is one of the cardinal core reforms that it brought into being. Electricity Act 2023. What's your own understanding and take on that particular act?
So thank you so much. With the 2023 Act, in principle, right, ideally, it sounds like a very, smart initiative and perhaps the best way to go at this point that we are at. But while it sounds like that, we need to also be very careful about our position on that new Act of 2023. And here's why. Because what you've done essentially, and this needs to be cleared up, what you've done essentially is you've transferred the burden of energy generation, supply, and transmission into the hands of the state. If the state makes the same errors that the federal government made at the time when they privatized the industries, we would have no marginal utility from a transfer of that state ownership, because what you would then have is a creation of a new elite within the energy industry. So if you do not have that same transparent process that should have existed at the time when you privatized the discos, which in my personal opinion didn't even need to happen at all, right? If the state governments would apply the same models that the federal government has applied over the years that has not worked, in reality we would solve no problem. And so again, why I say in principle it makes sense is because the idea behind the Act of 2023 is a decentralization of the powers. So what it means is before, all of the powers regarding the electricity sector was on an exclusive legislative list and was in the hands of the federal government. And so states didn't have the powers to grant GenCos licenses, DisCos licenses, or transmission licenses. Transmission licenses has always been with the federal government. And so with the introduction of this new policy, of this new reform, they've granted the states now the ability to give out licenses, both generation licenses, distribution licenses, and transmission licenses. Beautiful in idea, in principle is beautiful, but the model by which the state would implement this course of action has to be very, very well interrogated. Because if that model would end up transferring the assets still into the hands of an elite group within society, then we would have a pandemic. But what could be a better approach to be used to better establish this new framework, such that it is more efficient for the people? First of all, right, one of the things that I think needs to happen is, like I said earlier on, that one, we establish clear, transparent licensing and procurement processes at the state level. That is, at the state level, all the companies who will be buying into the electricity industry will get licenses. They have to be credible. They need to show credibility. They need to show that they have the financial capacity to do it. Because in the event that it fails, the state would have no other option but to bail them out, because the state cannot function without electricity. And the interesting thing is that the private owners, they know this, and so they're able to hold us to ransom in those instances. But that's one. Those clear, transparent licensing processes has to be established. But more importantly, at the state level, there needs to be a constant encouragement of community ownership models for mini grids and off-grid models. What does that look like? So, for example, if you go to Akwa Ibom, right, in Ikwatesiere, in a community in Akwa Ibom, the community came together and built a small mini grid system to help supply some of their energy needs. At the state level, if you are going to have true decentralization, because true decentralization has to now mean that the people have the power over those systems. That's what true decentralization means. Because true decentralization doesn't just mean transferring the powers from the federal government to the state government. If it's going to remain at the executive, be it at the state level or the federal level, then it's not really decentralization. You've only changed where the center is. But if you are going to be doing that, then you need to also be able to encourage community ownership. So communities within the state should be incentivized and be supported in being able to build their own off-grid systems that can supply them. So imagine that every community now has their own energy systems within them. It reduces the burden on the state, but it also goes further to reduce the costs that the individuals bear. Because the community, because they own it, it would inform how they're able to set the pricing for their electricity. Because they own it. But if you do not have that if you don't encourage those kind of models, then we'll be back to the starting point. But even more than just that, we also need to remember that different states have different financial capacity. So when you say you've decentralized it and the states now have power, you risk the likelihood of having an unequitable distribution of electricity supply within the country. In the sense, particularly if the federal government, now by virtue of this transfer of powers to the states, now pulls back a bit from the entire electricity industry, which is one of the things that I sense they're about to do, which is going to be very problematic in the future. But in the event that now happens, it means that Lagos State, who has so much more revenue, would be able to generate more electricity than say Jigawa State, for example. Now, it then means that by virtue of just existing within Lagos, you now have access to more electricity than you would have in Jigawa, regardless of the fact that wherever you are across the country, you should be able to have an access undistributed access to stable electricity. So in the event that you have this privatization, this decentralization rather, without the full federal government support, that is the federal government still being actively involved and being able to provide incentives to states, or more than just incentives, we also be able to provide investments to balance out the uneven distribution of wealth across states, you will still have a very distorted electricity supply, in the sense that the stronger state would have more electricity than the weaker state. And that disparity would not create national development, because if development is not spread on a national level, if you still have regions who are severely underdeveloped, then you've not achieved any through gain, and you will not be able to achieve the national cohesion that we want. Exactly. So there needs to still be some degree of subsidization on that level if you are going to be able to. So these are a number of things that I think that if we're going to be having the electricity framework, the new framework, and it's going to be as effective as it needs to be. Exactly. These are some of the things that need to be put in place for us to achieve those outcomes.
Joseph Amos, I really want to appreciate you for coming on the issue, and quite laudable. Your submission are quite very interesting, I will say, because most of us have seen this act as a good one, but we also need to interrogate the implementation going forward. So thank you so much for coming on the show today. We hope to have you soon to also help us to look at renewable energy going forward. Thank you so much, Joseph Amos.
Thank you for having me. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Same to you. I've been speaking with Joseph Amos, a renewable energy specialist and a project manager in the electricity sector, particularly in Nigeria. And he has spoken to us on the President Bola Ahmed Tinubu reform in the electricity sector, particularly the act that President Bola Ahmed signed into law. Very laudable law that will decentralize electricity generation in Nigeria. But we also need to look at the challenges that may come from it. And that's what Joseph has helped us to take a cue. Just like what Muta also said about the capital market. Good laws, good reforms, all going together under President Bola Ahmed Tinubu. Today,